birth of an idea. Before the world learned to measure value in numbers, before cities pulsed with commerce and ambition, there were only people living close to the earth, trading what they could, and trusting the rhythm of the seasons. Life was slow, circular, and small. Fields and faith ruled the hearts of men. A loaf of bread, a jug of milk, a handful of grain. These were the quiet treasures of the medieval world. Wealth was inherited, not earned. You were born into your place, like a seed in soil that never shifted. And yet, somewhere in that stillness, a spark began to flicker. In the narrow streets of Europe's early towns, merchants gathered beneath creaking wooden beams, their stalls lined with cloth, spices, and copper. They spoke not of lineage, but of exchange. Their hands were rough from travel, their minds alive with curiosity. They began to see value not as something divine. A farmer could sell more than crops. A craftsman could sell his skill. The idea was radical, almost dangerous. That the individual, not the crown, not the church, could determine their own worth. And so, the first embers of capitalism glowed. Quietly, softly, it took root in places few noticed. In trade fairs where laughter mixed with bargaining. In the ledgers of Italian bankers who invented double-entry bookkeeping. In the restless dreams of sailors who wanted to see beyond the horizon. Old coins passed between hands, but so too did ideas about credit, ownership, and freedom. For the first time, people began to think not just about surviving, but about growing. The shift was subtle, yet seismic. Feudal lords, once secure atop their stone towers, began to sense a tremor beneath their power. Merchants, once lowly in status, were now rising with wealth that could rival nobility. Towns where once loyalty was bound to blood, now it was bound to opportunity. A man could become more than his birth. The streets buzzed with possibility. The air itself seemed to shimmer with a new kind of hope. The belief that fortune was not a gift from kings or gods, but something one could make. And yet, every birth carries a shadow. As opportunity grew, so did inequality. The promise of freedom also meant the risk of failure. Some thrived, while others stumbled into debt and despair. Capitalism's earliest form was fragile, still learning to walk, still unsure of its own morality. But like all newborn forces, it was driven by hunger, not for food, but for motion, for progress. And innovation began to take shape, not yet cold, corporate words, but living ones, filled with wonder and fear. Capitalism was not yet a system. It was a feeling, a current pulling the world forward. As the medieval order gave way to the Renaissance, this current grew stronger. Art, science, and trade fed each other like rivers converging into a mighty stream. Capitalism gave people the means to create, and creation gave rise to new markets. Painters needed patrons. Inventors needed investors. The exchange of money became the exchange of ideas, and the human imagination, long restrained by hierarchy, began to roam free. But the world was still small, limited by land, by language, by law. The markets that began in cobblestone alleys would soon seek wider roads, across seas, across continents. Capitalism, like a restless traveler, was preparing to leave home. Its roots were in Europe, but its dreams were boundless. And so, as the candles flickered in counting houses and the first banks opened their heavy doors, the age of exploration was already stirring. Ships waited in harbors, their sails catching the wind of something larger than trade, the desire to expand, to connect, to conquer. Capitalism had been born from human curiosity and courage, but now it would test the limits of both. The birth of an idea had become the beginning of a journey. And like all journeys, it would carry both light and shadow, creation and cost. Yet even then, as gold gleamed under torchlight and merchants whispered of faraway lands, few could have imagined how far this idea would go, how completely it would reshape the world. And so, as the night deepened and the old world began to fade, the seed of capitalism took root. The age of discovery. The world was once a mystery, a map half drawn, its edges marked by dragons and myths. But in the hearts of sailors and merchants, curiosity burned brighter than fear. The seas called to them, vast, untamed, and glimmering with promise. It was the 15th century, and the winds of discovery had begun to stir. Capitalism, still young but restless, found in those winds its wings. Empires were hungry for gold, for land, for glory. But beneath those ambitions was something subtler, something more enduring: the pursuit of trade. The quest for wealth no longer meant hoarding treasure in castles. It meant finding new markets, new goods, new worlds. The old systems of feudal power were too small for such dreams. Capitalism needed horizons. And so ships set sail from Portugal, from Spain, from England and the Netherlands, carrying not only sailors and cargo, but the hopes of merchants and breathing canvas. Silk, spices, sugar, and silver flowed like veins of gold across oceans. The global marketplace was being born, one perilous voyage at a time. But this age of discovery was no simple story of courage and curiosity. The waves that carried progress also carried conquest. Where explorers saw opportunity, others saw invasion. The trade that promised connection often brought chains. Capitalism's reach expanded, but so too did its shadow. Still, in the ports and marketplaces of Europe, a new rhythm took hold. The sound of ships creaking into harbor, barrels rolling on cobblestones, merchants shouting prices. It was the sound of a new world taking shape. Each voyage brought not just goods, but knowledge. Navigation improved. Maps became clearer. And suddenly, The earth itself seemed smaller, more knowable, more profitable. For the first time, the world's wealth was no longer tied to what one could harvest or mine at home. Eat invisible but unstoppable. Coffee from Arabia, cotton from India, tobacco from the Americas. What began as exploration soon became enterprise. The old notion of wealth as a static inheritance gave way to a dynamic, expanding web of exchange. And in this global web, nations rose and fell. Portugal built its empire on spice and sugar, Spain on silver and gold. England and the Dutch Republic turned trade itself into power, creating companies that would outlive kings. The East India Companies became symbols of capitalism's new face. Private ventures with public might, where profit and politics blurred into one. These early corporations were unlike anything the world had seen before. They commanded armies, minted coins, and governed lands. Capitalism had grown from market stalls into empires. And with that growth came a profound transformation. Wealth was no longer just personal, it was systemic. It moved through. Yet amid this expansion, a quiet transformation was happening in the human mind. People began to see the world differently, not as a fixed order, but as a place of endless opportunity. The seas became symbols of freedom, the markets symbols of mobility. A farmer's son could become a merchant's son could become a banker. The boundaries of birth were dissolving, replaced by the fluidity of trade. But as wealth crossed oceans, so did exploitation. Colonies became the engines of European prosperity, powered by the labor of the enslaved and the dispossessed. Capitalism's promise of freedom was intertwined with its greatest contradiction, that one man's fortune could rest upon another's suffering. The sugar that sweetened European tea came from fields soaked in blood. The gold that glittered in crowns and coins had been torn from the hands of the conquered. Still, the system endured, not because it was just, but because it was powerful. Capitalism had proven its greatest truth: adaptability. It could thrive in any soil, on any shore, bending human ambition to its will. By the end of the Age of Discovery, the world was forever changed. Oceans no longer divided civilizations, they connected them. The first threads of globalization were woven, shimmering with both promise and peril. Humanity had stepped beyond the horizon, and in doing so, had bound its fate to the tides of commerce. And as night fell over the great ports of Lisbon and London, where lanterns flickered beside ships heavy with riches, one could almost hear the whisper of the coming age, an age where invention, not exploration, would drive the pulse of progress. The seas had carried capitalism across the world. Now it would find a new engine, one made not of wind and wood, but of iron and fire. A machine awakens. The dawn came not with sunlight, but with smoke. A low, steady hum began to rise over the hills of England. The sound of gears turning, pistons pumping, and furnaces roaring with unearthly light. The world, once ruled by muscle and soil, was giving birth to something entirely new: the machine. For centuries, human hands had shaped everything: the plow, the loom, the wheel. But now, iron and steam would reshape the hands themselves. The Industrial Revolution had begun, and with it, capitalism shed its old skin and became something vast, mechanical, and unrelenting. In the quiet towns of northern England, farmers left their fields for factories. Their calloused hands, once used to soil, now turned levers and spun spindles. The air filled with the scent of coal and metal, heavy, alive, unstoppable. Cities grew overnight, brick by brick. The sky darkened by ambition. Capitalism had found its heartbeat, the factory. Within its walls, time became money, and motion became value. The rhythm of life was no longer the rising of the sun, but the ticking of the clock. Work became measured, precise, relentless. But for those who toiled beneath the iron beams, there was both awe and ache. They were part of something grand, the creation of an age, and yet they felt themselves swallowed by it. Still, invention was intoxicating. Steam engines, spinning jennies, and power looms multiplied human strength 100-fold. Trains thundered across lands that once took weeks to cross. Goods, once reserved for the wealthy, cloth, utensils, books, became accessible to ordinary families. Capitalism promised abundance, and for a moment it seemed to deliver it. But abundance came with a cost. In the crowded slums of Manchester and Birmingham, smoke choked the air, and sickness lingered. Children worked long hours under the roar of machines, their small bodies swallowed by the hunger of progress. The same system that lifted some into mansions left others sleeping in soot. And yet, even in the shadows, a strange faith endured. Faith in progress, in movement, in the idea that tomorrow would always be better than today. The machine had not only changed labor, it had changed time itself. Humanity began to think in decades, in production cycles, in growth charts. The future became an obsession, and capitalism became its architect. Inventors became the new heroes of this era. Not kings or warriors, but dreamers with grease-stained hands and restless eyes. James Watt with his steam engine, Richard Arkwright with his water frame, George Stephenson with his locomotive. Their creations were not just tools, but symbols of possibility. Each invention expanded the borders of what humans could imagine. Even ourselves, in terms of productivity and profit. The fields of the past had grown food. The factories of the present grew wealth. By the mid-19th century, the world had become a machine of its own making, one that could not easily be stopped. Trains connected continents, telegraphs carried voices across oceans, and capitalism, now fully awakened, had become the most powerful force humanity had ever unleashed. And yet, in the soft hours of evening, as the last factory lamps dimmed and the towns fell silent, one could feel a question hanging in the air, unspoken, almost sacred. Had humanity built these machines to serve itself, or had it become their servant? As the night deepened, the smoke from the chimneys began to fade into stars, and the world turned quietly toward a new chapter, one where wealth would no longer be forged by invention alone, but by the titans who would rise to command it. Empires of industry. The smoke had cleared enough for the world to see its new monarchs. Not kings draped in gold, but men draped in power. Their crowns were the factories they owned, their empires made of iron, oil, and ambition. The 19th century had birthed a new ruling class, the industrialists. They were the architects of capitalism's grandest dream and its deepest contradiction. Their names would echo through time. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan. To the masses, they were titans. To their rivals, they were predators. They built railroads that stretched across continents, refineries that turned oil into empire, steel mills that forged the skeletons of modern cities. Every bridge, every ship, every glimmering skyline bore their invisible signatures. And yet, behind the shimmer of innovation lay the grind of inequality. The workers who kept the machines alive were paid little. But so did the shadows between them. Poverty lingered at the edges of wealth, as if the world itself could not decide whether to marvel or mourn. But for the first time in history, capitalism had given humanity something divine: scale, the ability to build beyond measure, to organize millions, to shape entire nations around industry and trade. The cities of the new age were cathedrals of commerce. Trains screamed through tunnels like veins of progress. Light bulbs flickered in homes that had once known only candles. Capitalism had become a faith, and industry its cathedral. The industrialists were its priests. They preached the gospel of progress, of efficiency, of relentless growth. Work harder, they said, and you can rise. And indeed, some did. A boy from the slums might one day own his own shop, his own business, his own dream. But for most, the ladder was steep and slick with sweat. Still, the hope remained, and that hope was capitalism's greatest invention of all. A late 19th century glittered with this paradox. On one side, opulence, ballrooms glowing with chandeliers, steamships gliding across oceans, inventions transforming daily life. On the other, exhaustion, men collapsing in factories, children coughing in coal dust, women working until dawn. The same fire that forged prosperity burned those too close to it. And yet, amid the turmoil, a strange beauty persisted. Humanity had never moved with such purpose, never dreamed on such a scale. Skyscrapers began to rise, their steel frames cutting through clouds, monuments to both ingenuity and ego. The railways wove continents together, shrinking distances that once took lifetimes to cross. The world was no longer local. It was interconnected, industrialized, alive with motion. Capitalism had entered its golden age, not gentle, but glorious. The electric light, the motor car, the pace of life quickened. The heartbeat of progress grew louder. And yet, in that rising rhythm, something quieter began to stir. A question. What was all this for? Even the richest men, surrounded by their wealth, sometimes felt the unease. Andrew Carnegie, after building one of the largest fortunes in history, turned to philanthropy, giving away vast sums to libraries and universities. He believed that wealth was a trust, a duty, not a prize. John D. Rockefeller, ruthless in business, became gentle in charity. Perhaps they understood what capitalism itself was beginning to forget. That progress without purpose is only motion, not meaning. The empires of industry stood tall, but they were fragile, balanced on markets that could falter, on workers who could. The system that had promised endless growth was learning that even ambition has limits. And yet, the spirit of the age refused to slow. New industries rose on the ashes of old ones. Electricity replaced steam. Automobiles replaced horses. The machine kept moving forward, dragging humanity along in its wake. The rich grew richer, but so too did the belief that progress was inevitable, that tomorrow would always be brighter, faster, better. By the turn of the century, the world had been remade. The age of kings had ended. The age of capital had begun. Factories now stood where palaces once did, and money had replaced nobility as the measure of power. Humanity had built its empires not on land or blood, but on labor, innovation, and desire. But the higher an empire rises, the longer its shadow grows, and soon the light of prosperity would flicker. The world's faith in infinite growth. And so, as the century turned and the cities glowed against the night, capitalism stood triumphant, unaware that its greatest test was quietly approaching, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. The crashes and the cries. The 20th century began with a heartbeat of confidence. The world seemed unstoppable. Engines roared, markets soared, and fortunes multiplied like stars across the sky. Cities pulsed with optimism. Stock tickers rattled endlessly in glowing offices, and the future felt certain, golden, invincible. The spirit of capitalism had never burned brighter, but fire, when left untended, always consumes. Beneath the glitter of the roaring 20s, beneath the jazz and champagne, the factories and fortunes, something fragile was breaking. The world had built its new temple on speculation, not stone. Everyone wanted more. Farmers borrowed to buy land. Families borrowed to buy homes. Businesses borrowed to chase expansion. Oh, it was a dizzying dance of credit and confidence, a system that seemed too beautiful to fail. And then, in a single moment, it did. The year was 1929. The markets fell like a curtain closing on a dream. Fortunes vanished overnight. Banks crumbled. Shops closed. Men who once ruled the trading floors found themselves standing in bread lines. In the span of months, the pulse of capitalism slowed to a whisper. The Great Depression had arrived, and it swept across the world. When everything breaks, the will to rebuild stirs quietly in the heart. Leaders began to emerge, speaking of reform, of responsibility, of rebuilding capitalism into something gentler, wiser, more humane. Franklin D. Roosevelt's voice carried across American radios like a candle in the dark, reminding millions that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Governments stepped in, creating jobs, stabilizing banks, rewriting the rules of the market. The invisible hand that once guided capitalism was joined by another, the steady hand of the state. For the first time, nations began to understand that prosperity could not exist without protection. Laws were passed to guard against greed's excess. New systems were built to prevent collapse. Capitalism, wounded but alive, began to evolve. And as the world struggled through the 1930s, something profound happened. Out of the ash, communities leaned on each other. Labor unions grew stronger, giving voice to those who had long been silent. The idea that progress should serve people, not just profit, began to take root. Yet even as recovery flickered to life, the storm clouds of war began to gather. Nations, desperate to revive their economies, turned to militarization, to conquest, to ideology. The very engines that had once powered peace now prepared for destruction. Capitalism, once again, would find itself at the heart of a global reckoning. But before the war began, before the world tore itself apart, something beautiful endured amid the wreckage, a renewed understanding of value. People learned that wealth was not only measured in money, but in stability, dignity, and trust. The Great Depression, for all its misery, reminded humanity that progress without balance is a hollow victory. By the late 1930s, the world had begun to rebuild. New Deal programs reshaped the United States. Just Europe sought recovery through cooperation. Economies adapted. And though the scars would remain, capitalism had proven what may be its most enduring trait: its ability to survive its own destruction. It had fallen, and it had learned. The markets would rise again, the factories would roar again, and the world would dream again. But this time, the dream carried a shadow. The knowledge that progress, if left unchecked, could consume itself. And so, as the Great Depression slowly gave way to a fragile dawn, the world exhaled in weary relief. The age of despair was ending. But what came next? The fires of war, the rebuilding of nations, the birth of modern capitalism, would test humanity like never before. The machine would roar back to life, not in factories of peace, but in the forges of conflict. The war machine and the rebuilder. The world had barely begun to heal when the drums of war began to sound again. Factories that had once built cars and clothes now built tanks and rifles. The hum of industry deepened into a growl, and capitalism, that restless engine of ambition, became a weapon. The Second World War was not just a conflict of nations. It was a collision of economies, of systems, of visions for humanity's future. The gears of the global machine began to turn with furious rhythm. Men were drafted, women stepped into factories, and nations poured their strength into production. Every rivet, every bullet, every heartbeat seemed to pulse with the urgency of survival. In America, the assembly lines of Ford and General Motors, once symbols of civilian prosperity, became the arteries of the war machine. The Allies' strength was measured not just in courage, but in output, became the difference between victory and defeat. And so, capitalism found itself repurposed. Its hunger for production, its drive for innovation, a collective vow to rebuild, to never let the world fall so far again. Factories reopened, but this time their purpose changed. Where once they forged tanks, they now built tractors and cars. Steel that had once armored destruction now framed the bones of new cities. The hum of post-war capitalism was different, softer, more hopeful, filled with the murmur of renewal. In America, prosperity returned like spring after a long winter. The GI Bill sent soldiers to college. Suburbs bloomed. New industries, aviation, electronics, household goods began to thrive. Europe, through the Marshall Plan, found a lifeline of investment and aid, turning rubble into foundation. Capitalism, once the war's engine, became the architect of recovery. But it was not the same capitalism that had collapsed in 1929. It had learned from its wounds. Governments now played God for a brief, golden moment. Profit and progress seems to walk hand in hand. Across the Atlantic, factories glowed through the night, pouring out consumer goods instead of weapons. Radios filled homes with music and hope. Cities buzzed with new life. The marketplace, once driven by survival, now thrived on desire. The desire for comfort, convenience, and modernity. A refrigerator, a car, a washing machine. These became the new symbols of victory. But even amid the joy of renewal, shadows lingered. The Cold War had begun. A quiet struggle, not of armies, but of ideologies. Capitalism now faced its mirror image, communism, in a contest not only for power, but for the soul of humanity. The world was divided by walls and fears, yet united by progress. Both systems raced to outbuild, outthink, outlast the other. And so, innovation quickened once again. Space began to push humanity beyond imagination. But beneath the shining surface of growth, a question persisted. Could capitalism's hunger ever be satisfied? Or was it doomed to keep consuming, endlessly seeking more? Still, for a time, the balance held. Capitalism had proven that it could rebuild what it destroyed, that it could adapt to peace as easily as war. In the ashes of global conflict, it had found its greatest justification, that through creation, even after devastation, humanity could rise again. And as night settled over the rebuilt cities, lights glowing softly through new windows, streets humming with quiet hope, one truth remained clear. The same machine that once fueled destruction had also forged recovery. Humanity, through pain and perseverance, had learned to turn its engines toward life once more. But history never rests. The peace of Reconstruction, that it would make the world believe in endless growth once again. And so, as the world tucked itself into a post-war dream, the stage was set for capitalism's most golden illusion, the golden age of growth. The war had ended, but something new was beginning. Something brighter, louder, more confident. The world, weary from years of blood and silence, exhaled, and capitalism inhaled deeply, filling its lungs with promise. The years that followed the Second World War shimmered with optimism. The factories roared again, but this time they sang a softer tune, one of abundance, leisure, and endless possibility. This was the golden age of growth, when capitalism wrapped itself in sunlight and prosperity seemed infinite. Between the 1950s and 1970s, the world entered a dreamlike state, a period where everything appeared to expand effortlessly. In the United States, highways, stretched like veins across suburban homes, rose like seashells along quiet cul-de-sacs, each with manicured lawns, white fences, and the gleam of a new car in the driveway. It was not just rebuilding, it was reimagining. The hum of refrigerators, televisions, and washing machines filled the air with a new rhythm of modern life. Advertisements painted visions of perfection, smiling families, shining kitchens, and the promise that happiness could be bought, wrapped, and delivered. Capitalism had transformed itself again, from survival and war to comfort and consumption. And yet, beneath the cheerful music and pastel-colored dreams, something profound was happening. The middle class, a concept almost mythical before, began to flourish. Ordinary people, once bound to fields and factories, now found themselves lifted by wages, credit, and hope. The marketplace, once an exclusive domain of the powerful, became a shared space of aspiration. ... Europe, too, blossomed. The scars of war faded beneath the glitter of Reconstruction. Paris sparkled again. London rebuilt. West Germany became an industrial miracle. Even Japan, once shattered, emerged as a new economic titan, its factories whispering precision and progress. Capitalism had proven it could not only survive catastrophe, it could thrive beyond it. But this prosperity was not just economic, it was cultural. The world was learning to dream in color. Music exploded with freedom. Jazz, rock, soul. Art broke from its frames. Cinema filled the darkened theaters with stories of hope and rebellion. Capitalism, ever the shapeshifter, began to intertwine itself with identity, with emotion, with the very idea of what it meant to live a modern life. Still, every dream has its quiet doubts. As production soared and goods multiplied, some began to wonder, was this endless consumption a path to happiness, or a cycle that would never end? Philosophers and poets whispered their unease, even as cities grew brighter and economies grew faster. The engine of capitalism, so perfectly tuned, was beginning to hum with a faint vibration of excess. For now, though, the world chose to dance. The baby boom filled homes with laughter and hope. Credit cards appeared, making money itself feel lighter, almost imaginary. Television carried advertisements straight into the heart of every home, telling people what to want before they even knew it themselves. The dream was alive, glossy, fast, intoxicating. In this golden glow, capitalism felt invincible. It had conquered poverty, expanded opportunity, and wrapped the world in a shimmering web of trade. Factories in America produced goods for homes in Europe. Japanese electronics filled American stores. The marketplace had become a global conversation. Inflation whispered through the markets. Oil prices trembled. The gap between rich and poor began to widen again, gently at first, like a hairline fracture in glass. Yet most looked away. The world wanted to believe in its golden age, because this was the dream, the promise that every generation would live better than the last. It was the story parents told their children, and nations told themselves. The lights of capitalism glowed brighter than ever. So bright that few noticed the shadows gathering at the edges. As the 1970s approached, the golden dream began to shimmer uncertainly. The oil crisis would dim the lights, recessions would cool the markets, and the world would awaken to a new, more complicated reality. But for a brief, shining moment, this was the age when capitalism felt like magic. And as the night deepened and the lights of 1,000 suburban homes flickered softly across, capitalism smiled, unaware that its next transformation would be both its greatest expansion and its most dangerous illusion. The global web and the digital revolution. The golden glow began to fade, but out of its dimming light, a new spark was born, small, flickering, electric. It started in laboratories, in quiet rooms filled with humming machines and blinking lights. No one could have known then that those tiny circuits and glowing screens would soon weave a web around the world. Capitalism was evolving again, slipping from the age of steel and smoke into the age of light and code. The world was shrinking. Satellites floated like silent eyes above the clouds. Cables ran beneath oceans, carrying whispers of data between continents. Factories that once thundered with the weight of machines began to give way to offices filled with the gentle tapping of keyboards, a ghost that could move at the speed of thought. The 1980s and 1990s arrived like a storm of neon and ambition. Silicon Valley became the new frontier, where dreamers with disheveled hair and sleepless eyes built empires from garages. Apple, Microsoft, Intel. Their names began as murmurs and grew into roars. The personal computer, once a luxury, became a household companion, a window into a vast new world. And then came the internet, that invisible thread that tied billions of souls together. With every connection, distance began to disappear. Letters became emails. Markets became global. And the world's economies merged into one vast, breathing organism. A person in Tokyo could sell to someone in New York before dawn. A student in Dhaka could learn from once paper and metal became digital, numbers on a screen, flowing in silent rivers through invisible banks. Borders blurred, time zones dissolved, and opportunity seemed infinite. But like all revolutions, this one came with its ghosts. As companies rose overnight, others fell just as fast. The digital age gave birth to fortunes measured in billions and collapses measured in seconds. The dot-com bubble swelled with excitement and burst with disappointment, reminding the world that even in cyberspace, gravity still existed. Still, humanity couldn't look away. The internet had become the new heartbeat of capitalism. Fast, restless, alive. Every click was a transaction, every search a desire, every post a reflection of what people wanted, feared, loved. The web was not just a marketplace of goods. It became a marketplace of attention, emotion, and identity. Corporations learned to listen, quietly, invisibly. Algorithms began to predict what people would crave before they even spoke it aloud. Capitalism, always hungry, now fed on data, the new oil of the modern world. The more people shared, the more it grew. Every movement, every purchase, every heartbeat online became part of a vast, self-learning machine that knew humanity more intimately than it knew itself. And yet, there was beauty here too. Voices once silenced found an audience. Artists could share their creations without gatekeepers. Small businesses could reach the world. Knowledge became as the millennium approached. Cities pulsed with light. Screens glowed in every home, and a new kind of wealth emerged. Not in land or labor, but in information. Whoever controlled the flow of data controlled the rhythm of the world. And somewhere between the hum of servers and the quiet tap of keys, a question began to echo again. Had capitalism reached its most perfect form, or had it simply become invisible? The 21st century waited, full of wonder and unease. The digital web was tightening, and capitalism was about to take its most powerful and perhaps perilous leap yet. And so, as the night deepened and the screens flickered softly in the dark, the hum of progress whispered, "The future has already begun." The invisible empire, capitalism in the 21st century. By the dawn of the 21st century, capitalism had become invisible. It was no longer something people saw in the marketplace or the factory floor. In the quiet hum of their networks, in the invisible algorithms shaping what they saw, thought, and bought. The old world of smoke and steel had dissolved into a digital mist. And within that mist, a new empire had risen, one without borders, flags, or faces. This empire was everywhere and nowhere. It didn't conquer nations. It conquered attention. Every second of every day became currency. Scroll by scroll, click by click, the human gaze was harvested, measured, and sold. The old merchants of the industrial age had traded coal and cloth. The new merchants of the modern age traded in data and dreams. Corporations were no longer just producers. They had become architects of perception. The biggest companies no longer made physical goods. They made worlds. Google mapped the earth. Meta built digital. Capitalism became not just economic, but emotional. A quiet, intimate force that shaped how people lived, worked, and even loved. The marketplace was now infinite. A teenager in Jakarta could sell handmade art to a stranger in Paris. A musician in Lagos could go viral overnight. The barriers of geography had vanished, replaced by the endless horizon of the digital world. Capitalism, for the first time, had truly gone global, not through ships or soldiers, but through signal and screen. And yet, beneath this shimmering web of progress, unease began to grow. The promise of equality that globalization had whispered began to fade. Factories moved to cheaper lands. Jobs evaporated in others. The same system that connected the world also divided it. The rich grew richer. Their wealth multiplied through invisible transactions and offshore vaults. The poor found themselves competing not just with neighbors, but with machines. The tireless entities began to shape the very rhythm of life. They knew what people wanted before they did, steering them gently toward desires they didn't realize they'd been taught to crave. The marketplace had become a mirror, one that reflected not who people were, but who capitalism wanted them to be. And yet, there was still wonder. The 21st century was a canvas of contradictions, dazzling and fragile. The digital empire allowed voices to rise, revolutions to spark, truths to travel faster than censorship. A single tweet could shake a government. A video could inspire millions. Capitalism had built a stage large enough for every voice, but it had also built an audience too distracted to truly listen. The lines between consumer and creator began to blur. Every photograph shared, every thought posted, every story uploaded added another thread to the great digital fabric. Capitalism, ever adaptive, smiled quietly. It didn't need to rule with force anymore. It ruled through desire, through convenience, through comfort. The cities of the modern world became temples of glass and light, where wealth was measured not in gold, but in code. Cryptocurrencies emerged, decentralized and untamed, promising freedom from the very banks that had defined capitalism for centuries. The blockchain whispered a new language of trust without institutions, of trade without borders. But as always, the dream of liberation carried its own shadow: speculation, manipulation, and greed. Still, capitalism continued to hum, endlessly reinventing itself. It moved into pockets and wrists, into voices and homes. It listened, learned, adapted. It became artificial intelligence, predicting choices before they were made. And as the world accelerated, something tender remained. A small, human longing for meaning beyond consumption. People began to look inward again. They asked, softly, what progress truly meant. Was it endless growth, or was it harmony? Was the marketplace serving humanity, or had humanity begun serving the marketplace? In that quiet questioning, capitalism faced its greatest challenge, not revolution, not collapse, but reflection. For the first time, the world could see itself through the mirror it had built. Every advertisement, every innovation, every click was a self-portrait of humanity's desires, beautiful and flawed. And so in this age of invisibility, capitalism became more than a system. It became a story, the story of human ambition, of creation and consequence. It was neither hero nor villain, but a reflection of the heart that built it. The digital empire stood vast and glowing. Beneath the static and the signals, the human spirit still whispered for balance, for a gentler rhythm, for a quieter dream. Because even in a world ruled by code and commerce, the softest truths remain the same. People still seek connection, belonging, and peace. And those, no matter how far capitalism evolves, can never be bought. The crisis of growth and the search for meaning. The 21st century arrived, not with a whisper, but with a warning. The hum of industry, once a song of progress, had grown into a roar, relentless, insistent, and exhausting. Capitalism, that ever-adaptable engine, had pushed humanity to heights never imagined. Yet with every peak came a shadow, stretching longer and darker than before. The world had grown richer, but also hungrier. Natural resources, humanity had built wonders, skyscrapers that kissed the clouds, networks that connected billions, medicine that extended life, but at a cost that could no longer be ignored. The question of sustainability had moved from margin to center. Could growth continue without destruction? And yet, growth remained irresistible. Corporations sought expansion in every corner of the globe. Markets craved innovation. Investors demanded returns. And technology raced forward at a speed that left reflection behind. Capitalism had become a cycle of perpetual acceleration, producing, consuming, expanding, repeating. The rhythm of life had become intertwined with the pulse of the system itself. Amid this dizzying pace, humanity began to ask quieter questions. Beyond profit, beyond efficiency, beyond the dazzling metrics of GDP, what truly mattered? People longed for meaning, for purpose, for balance. Movements emerged, environmental, social, cultural, reminding the world that wealth without care and progress without conscience could never be complete. The ethical heartbeat of capitalism was being tested. Simultaneously, technology introduced new paradoxes. Automation promised liberation from labor, but threatened livelihoods. Artificial intelligence offered knowledge and convenience, but carried the risk of surveillance, manipulation, and concentration of power. The very systems built to enhance human freedom sometimes constrained it. Subtly, invisibly, like the shadows of a sunrise. Capitalism had expanded beyond imagination. Yet it now confronted limits not of desire, but of consequence. Yet even in the midst of uncertainty, there was hope. The crisis of growth sparked creativity, reflection, and collaboration. Individuals and communities began to reimagine consumption, ownership, and responsibility. Ideas like circular economies, sustainable finance, and ethical investment began to surface, suggesting that progress could coexist with care. Humanity had glimpsed a new possibility, that capitalism, guided by conscience as well as ambition, might evolve once again. The 21st century's challenge is not merely economic. It is existential. It asks the world to pause amid acceleration, to consider the impact of endless desire, and to redefine wealth in ways that honor both people and planet. The system that once reshaped continents must now reconcile with limits, finite resources, fragile ecosystems, and the deepest needs of the human spirit. And so, capitalism stands at a crossroads, glowing and humming with potential, yet whispering caution. Its story is no longer only about accumulation, invention, or expansion. It is also about reflection, responsibility, and connection. The invisible empire has taught humanity that power, when untethered, can become perilous. But it has also shown that innovation, when guided by wisdom, can be transformative. As night falls over modern cities, neon lights shimmering against rivers, satellites silently circling above, screens glowing in countless homes, the story continues. Humanity watches itself through the mirror of its creation, learning the eternal lesson that growth is not inherently virtuous and progress is not complete without conscience. Capitalism, in all its brilliance and contradiction, remains the story of human ambition, endlessly evolving, endlessly questioning, endlessly seeking meaning. And in its latest chapter, the world learns that the truest form of wealth may not lie in currency, data, or goods, but in harmony, care, and the courage to shape a future that serves not only ourselves, but the generations yet to come. And so, as the night deepens, as cities rest, and the hum of the global machine softens to a whisper, the story of capitalism is still being written by every choice, every innovation, every heartbeat of humanity, reflections, and the path forward. The story of capitalism is not a tale of triumph alone, nor of failure. It is a story of movement, of desire and creation, of shadow and light, of humanity learning from itself. From the wooden ships that carried explorers across uncharted seas, to the invisible digital networks that now connect billions, capitalism has been a quiet, persistent force shaping the shape of the world. As night settles softly over the modern landscape, one can trace its path through the centuries. the merchants of Venice, the factories of Manchester, the skyscrapers of New York, the glowing screens of Silicon Valley. Each era added its own rhythm, its own melody, to a song that teaching us that ambition without wisdom can consume as easily as it creates. The lessons of history are gentle but insistent. Capitalism has the power to lift humanity to astonishing heights, to expand horizons, and to connect the globe in ways once unimaginable. Yet it also carries the burden of consequence. For every wealth created, there are shadows cast. For every innovation that liberates, there is a cost that must be reckoned with. Its story is intertwined with ours, where progress is measured not only in production, but in the well-being of people and the planet. Even now, as the world hums quietly under starlit skies, one can feel the soft pulse of possibility. Small innovations, acts of conscience, shifts in perspective, these are the quiet engines that may guide capitalism into a future that honors its potential without succumbing to its perils. The choices made today will ripple through markets, societies, and ecosystems, shaping the story for generations yet unborn. The great beauty of capitalism is that it is not static. It adapts, transforms, and evolves. It learns from failure, recovers from collapse, and rises again in new forms. Humanity, too, must adapt, learning to harness ambition with wisdom, desire with responsibility, and freedom with conscience. As we close this chapter of reflection, there is a gentle reassurance. The story is not finished. It is alive, unfolding in the quiet decisions, bold innovations, and persistent hopes of every person connected to this vast web of exchange. The night may be long, but each dawn brings opportunity, a chance to shape the system that shapes us with intention, care, and imagination. And so, as your eyes grow heavy and the world softens into silence, let the thought linger. Capitalism has changed the world forever, but the next chapter, the one we are writing together, holds the promise of transformation, of wisdom, and of a future where growth is guided not only by ambition, but by the quiet, enduring heartbeat of humanity itself. If these words have carried you closer to sleep, let this story remain with you tonight as a gentle companion through the quiet, dreaming world beyond.